session. It is Arseny Roginsky. Arseny Roginsky is probably known to the majority of you. He's a historian, a human rights activist, head of the Memorial Group. Memorial Group has been in existence for many years, and it studies repressions, re-establishment of names, commemoration of names, and rehabilitation of victims of terror. This is a very important activity for each Russian citizen. This is our historic memory. This is our historic policy, which determines our understanding of the past, present, and future. And we thank Arseny to find time. Tomorrow they have a very important memorial action, and Arseny will tell us about it. Now we listen to Arseny, then we ask questions. Hello, dear colleagues. I am pleased, as usual, to speak at the school, and today it's a double pleasure because many of you are teachers. That's very important for me because I am a school teacher with a past through several generations. My mother has always been a teacher, and my son is a school teacher now. And this business is quite close to my heart. I'll talk to you about the memory and the Soviet terror. And the day after tomorrow is the day of memory of victims. And this date is not chancy. You may not know why it is October the 30th. This date was approved by special order of the Supreme Soviet of the Russian Soviet Federative Republic. It was in 91. As far as the date is concerned, well, political prisoners and political camps did not end with the death of Stalin. They continued in the 60s, 70s, and the 80s, and last arrest following the Article 58 or Article 70 in the new codex, it took place in January 1987. So political camps were there. In the 70s, there were about 1,000 people, but those were nice and decent people. And in the 70s, the political prisoners turned out to be the important factor in internal and international policy. People who were jailed, they fought for their rights, for their dignity. And in 1974, political prisoners who were in Perm or Mordovia camps and Vladimir jail. And at that time, there were just three places: Mordovia, Perm, and Vladimir. Those were three places for political prisoners. They somehow decided then on October 13, they declared it the day of a political prisoner in the USSR. And there were one-day hunger strikes in all these three camps for the rights of political prisoners, which authorities did not want to recognize. So it was all prepared. Letters came in different ways, and at the apartment of academician Andrei Sakharov, a press conference was held related to the situation in the camp or in the camps. So the date was set. It was October 30th, and later in 91 we offered to name it the day of a political prisoner. But there was a discussion in the parliaments, and it was the day of memory of victims of political repressions. That's how it is officially called. So that's the fight for human rights and rights of on human dignity. The Soviet terror affected the life in this country for two reasons. First of all, this terror was lengthy. If we take the period of mass terror from 18th to 1953 till the death of Stalin, it is still 35 years, 3 times as much as domination of Nazi in Germany, for instance. It's a very lengthy period of time, and selective terror went on even later, meaning hundreds of people were arrested, not hundreds of thousands, but it continued in all the years of the Soviet power, and it was established officially that this terror was one of the most important methods and ways to manage the country. This was an instrument in the hands of authorities, and that's how they retained the power during all these decades. So it was long. That's number one. Now, the scope, I'll talk about this for 5 minutes because you are historical people. Well, some people say that it's not possible to establish the scope of terror, but it is possible. I mean, the direct terror, people who were affected directly. Of course, there were other people who were around the victims. It's hard to determine them. Now, how are we going to count the victims? Now, we use the following way to do it, by categories. You base on the Russian law on rehabilitation and its definitions, and the law of October 18. You may go and find it, and it defines the victims of terror, political motives, and so on. So, who is to be rehabilitated? And what about the sources? Sources are there. There are annual reports of the state security bodies, enormous sheets, tables. Annually, each region, each department of KGB or NKVD sent their tables to the center. In the center, they were reconciled. And these figures are not fictitious. So unfortunately, this statistical reporting, which is still there in a special fund, number 8 of the Central Archives of the Federal State Security, where I spent years probably in these archives. So they start only from 1921, a regular reporting. What about 18, 19 and 20? This is not full. This is not full. I mean, it was not yet centralized. Relationships between the center and the regions were not quite regular. So that really means that the figures of 1918, 1920 are floating. As of 1921, these figures are they cover the whole territory, so to speak. All the terror victims are to be divided into two parts. To simplify the calculation, people who were arrested on individual accusations, meaning you have a file. All the files, by the way, have been retained. Something is missing, definitely, but mostly all the files are there. There is a file with the order for arrest, a warrant, a questionnaire, a protocol of interrogation, conviction, and such individual files, and that's people who were arrested by individual accusations, and they were convicted by judicial or non-judicial bodies on the basis of different categories, different articles of the criminal code. And the second category is the people without files. Those were people who were judged following some orders or some collective initiatives. These people were taken away from the places of their habitation, their property was taken away, and they were sent to Siberia or Kazakhstan, somewhere to the north. So in this case, there were no files, because the cases started only there where they were brought in. They lived in a special labor settlements. This is something like Gulag. But the files were there. Their files were there. And in the places where they deported, well, the documents are not full. Recently, we had a session. I am part of the Presidential Commission on Rehabilitation of Victims of Political Depressions. 2 days ago, we had a special session on how the process of rehabilitation in the Crimea takes place. This is our new territory. And we know how many people were deported from the Crimea, Tartars, Greeks, and so on. We have these figures from the reports, from the centralized reports. We know approximately how many people are there. But locally, there are only 46,000 files, which is a small group. Mostly cases and files somewhere in Uzbekistan or in Tajikistan. And that is why the process of rehabilitation of Crimea Tatars is lagging behind. Today we have 15,000 applications, which is many. But we gave out only about 800 documents, because in Uzbekistan you have to find it and send it to the Crimea, and it takes time, and it goes through Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Now, getting back to the individual accusations, how many people were accused by the state security bodies for all years of the Soviet power? If we take statistics year after year and then sum it all up, it is about 7 million people. 7 million. There are certain figures for 1918 or 1919, but altogether it's 7 million. Not people, but 7 million of statistic units in the table. You see the difference? No, you don't. Okay. Okay, if you don't understand something, just tell me. Okay, I'll tell you the difference. Imagine you are a peasant arrested in 1932. You were arrested, you received 5 years of imprisonment, and you were sent to the camp, which is pretty standard. And in 1937, you were arrested again, and then you were shot. So in the table, you will be mentioned twice. So there were 2 sticks for you. And if you are a social democrat, Menshevik, then you were arrested for the first time in 1923, and you received 3 years of imprisonment. In 1926, you were convicted yet again after being freed for 3 years of exile. In 1929, when you were liberated, you received another conviction which didn't allow you to live in the majority of big towns. In 1933, you were arrested for the 4th time, and so on, and so on. And then you were shot. If you were not shot in 1947, you were arrested again. So this will be your 5th or 6th arrest. We have many people with 5, 6, or 7 arrests. So the number of checks will be 7. Because reporting is very simple. We show how many people were arrested this year. So it's not 7 million. Understand? Less than that, of course. And that's one criteria. Of course, I am a lover of the state security bodies, as you understand. But the state security didn't deal with political cases only. Smuggling, counterfeiting, banditism, not political banditism, not, but just regular banditism, banditry, especially when it was of a large scale, administrative crimes as well, and there were so many of them. So I studied it all year after year, and I know that about 23% of people out of those who were arrested were arrested not for political reasons, so we have to subtract them again. And then those whom I mentioned, those who were repeated twice or thrice. So still you can't get a precise figure, but it is about 4.8 and 5.2 million instead of 7. People who were arrested for political reasons by the state security bodies during the years of the Soviet power. Uh, I somehow think that teachers should understand such things. That's why I am delivering this to you, because it was never mentioned anywhere. The second category is more clear, because mostly it was one repression. So those who were deported from the second category, there were about 6.2, 6.4 million people. For instance, Cossacks from Preterechia in 1920, so 45,000 people. Kulaks were exiled, and that's pretty complicated because there was 1.8 million people for the first category, but there was also category number 3 when people were sent within the borders of their region. Everything was taken away from you, but within the region. For instance, a family of Boris Yeltsin was an example. They belong to the third category. So it's 2.5 million people approximately in this category. Or deportation of Koreans from Far East, 181,000 people. And then people were deported from newly acquired territories in 1939 and 1940, and deportation from this territory, 300,000 from the eastern Poland, which is actually what we call Western Ukraine, Western Belarus, and about 100,000 from the Baltics, from Moldavia, and so on. And then enormous German preventive deportation in the beginning of the war, about 1 million people. So altogether, for this category, approximately, and you can't avoid approximation here, so approximately it was 6.2, 6.4 million people. Now, what is the total sum? About 11.5 million people of direct victims. Nobody was responsible for special Russian statistics. And this is the statistics for the Soviet Union. Anyway, the scope of the terror was enormous. But now, in the Russian Federation, people with ID as a victim of political repression, there are about 800,000 of them. 850,000, I think, at the beginning of 2013. Of course, people die. So in the majority of cases, these are not the victims which I mentioned now. It's their children who were underaged. And of course, they were together with their parents, the exile zones, or they were born there. And the same is true about camps. The figure is quite big still. In many ways, it's just the Northern Caucasus republics. Deportation of the punished people was especially enormous. In case of Chechen and Ingush, it was 484,000 people. It was total. based on ethnic principle, and no other principle was there. The genocide is a popular word, actually, but in this particular case, we can use this word because truly it was ethnic deportation.
And so, say, if in a village there were 20 Chechen houses and one Belarusian house, Belarusians were not deported. Just to make it clear. So the question is as follows. So with that great scope of terror, and if we add to that terror the closest relatives of those deported families who also suffered a lot. So why is why does the terror in our memories take so little space and somewhere in the periphery? Some phenomena are kept in our memory. So if you are teachers and if you've been working in that profession for quite some time, you can easily understand the event that left the biggest impact in history. I believed it was the repressions, terror of 1937. No, I was mistaken. It's collectivization of the agriculture and purges of wealthy peasants and farmers. That tragic event, left the biggest impact in the memory of the people. I can just refer to some figures. 1925, 62,000, 27, 75, 2,812,000 arrested. Then comes 1929. 207, 1930, 387,000, 1931, 400, and 1932, 500, over 500,000. And that's only the people who were arrested in those years. That was just a very dramatic rise. But deportation was separate. I think about 2.5 million were deported. 1.8 were deported to Siberia, and about other 300,000 were deported, falling under third category. So it's quite a shock. The family memories keep those events. But I wonder why our people in mass fail to learn from this lesson. In Western Europe, on the ruins of World War II, or peace, was being built on some new foundations, on updated principles of freedom and rights. Holocaust is one of the pillars of the European new identity. While in this country, terror didn't evolve as a pillar of our identity. I believe that in the first place, there is no understanding or comprehension in people's minds of that fact. We have a lot of statistics, a lot of data. Hundreds of books were published on the theme of terror. But it's just a texture. And no lessons were learned from that. And speaking of lessons, what kind of lessons can be learned from those facts? And now I'm switching to, I think, important things. First, people in mass when they think of terror, they they have no references or guidelines. There is not a single national act that would identify a crime as a crime. So instead of a legal act, we have millions of single ID of victims and ideas of rehabilitation and those people who were whose crimes were reconsidered. Well, I was talking to some teachers, and they say that you say that it's terrible, but and I talked to one of the officials in the local administration, and he said that it had not been, in fact, in reality. So what about the truth? The truth can be really legitimized. And back in 1991, when we were drafting a law on rehabilitation, we thought that it would be only the first act, but it stayed to be a single act on that. And some 3 years ago, I made a report at a meeting which was attended by the then President Medvedev. We submitted a program to him on that account, and looks like some items were adopted from the program to commemorate the memory of the victors, and perhaps without great desire, but those points will be implemented. However, the item that reads that we need to legitimize the fact that terror is a crime is missing from their deeds. Second, I can think of some peculiar features of our mass mentality. We are all sympathetic about the memory of victims, but from hardened Stalinists. So now people mostly have doubts that they were victims, and they are sympathetic of those victims. We erected some monuments to commemorate their memory, but sympathy alone cannot make people understand those bitter truths. The understanding comes from a fact that there is a victim that's a victim to a crime. What kind of a crime is that? Who is a criminal? And it's very important to understand. You can see a lot of chapels, crosses on those places where people were executed en masse, but there is no understanding who the criminal is. Why? Probably it's because it was the state-sponsored terror. A person is ready to recognize his neighbor as a criminal who reported wrongly about his grandfather. He can agree that the police or the investigator who tortured his grandfather can also be viewed as a criminal. And Russian people are not that temporal, and there were no universal reports. And but to imagine that it is the state who was the criminal is next to impossible for the people. Why? We were raised not for just 70 years, we were raised for thousands of years, believing that state cannot commit mistakes. We, the people, we are the citizens, the subjects of the greatest country, the greatest nation and state. And our country won wars, and it was our state. So that such a state cannot be a criminal. So it's a very important theme to understand that even inside we are too shy to say that the state is a criminal, so that responsibility can be imposed on that. And besides, there is another terrible thing that bring us together. That's the memory of World War II. That memory was transformed into just one idea, that is the idea of the victory, without any memory of the price of that victory. But this memory really bonds us, brings us together, because we won a war with absolute evil. Who won the war? It was our state. So we are inheritors of the greatest victory. Yes. Or are we the inheritors of the greatest crime? And that's quite a complex question. So human memory is very selective, and the two conflicting things cannot be put together. But in fact, certainly we are inheritors of both, of the greatest victory and the greatest crime. It depends on what you want to cultivate. If you want to cultivate a black and white person or a complex person, it depends. If it is black and white, then you should forget one component. But we need to upbring an intellectual, and it brings about a conflict of memory. It's very interesting. What is Stalin? On the one hand, we have thousands of documents telling us about personal Stalin's crimes. So, it became possible to execute so many people because those purges were not individual. They were purges against categories of people. That's the main feature of all those purges and repressions. So we defeated Hitler, the absolute evil. And Stalin was at the head of the country. Is it a fact? Yes, it is. We killed so many millions of our own people. And it was also state-sponsored. And the ruler was Stalin. How can we combine the two images? Next to impossible. And back in our minds, it cannot be combined, since one image pushes the other to the periphery imminently. So the memory of terror seems to have been pushed out of their minds because of its complexity. There is another illustration. The past, almost everywhere, is perceived in the categories of us and them. Just think of the memory in those former Soviet republics who became independent countries. Let's see how their memories work, and how their textbooks compiled. They say that before the Soviet Union, they lived in peace, and everything was fine. Then the Soviets came. And meaning not Soviets, but you understand, Russians. Then Russians came, they enslaved us, they began began repressing us. And back in 1991, we again acquired freedom. And in that sense, I swear, of multiple countries surrounding Russia do not differ. They differ only in the level of accusations against the Russians and the level of justifications. In some countries, such as in Azerbaijan, they wrote also that it was not only Russians but Armenians who pursued the repressions against Azeris. So again, there is a division, them and us. Let's stop and see if we Russians can say the same about ourselves. We cooked that cookie ourselves. Can we say that some other country invaded and occupied Russia? And it so happens that Russia is the country where Russians killed Russians. It's not us and aliens, it's us and us. And it's absolutely impossible to comprehend. And combined with the previous conflicts, so altogether it creates for the memory of terror a totally unsurmountable barrier. And that barrier could be surmounted should we have taken that effort long ago, back in 1991, not only us, the people, but the state too. Can you imagine how many letters I wrote to those intelligent people who made up the government and other ruling bodies back in 1990s? I was urging them to take care of those mass mentality. And we submitted our specific proposals. Do you know what responses were? Personally, to me, I received replies from various levels, and they all were telling me that, don't worry, we would build a market economy, and following that, freedom would come, and market and freedom together would ensure us all other liberties. So they thought of that market economy, and I stopped short of saying what they really built. But they believed that market is a sacred thing. On the eve of elections, they tried to be friendly to the people, but not in between. And then the year 2000 came, and a new identity emerged, and answers to the question what we are were really traditional. And if you ask that question now, the answer is that we are good Russians, we are the winners. We have always been bringing virtue to other people, but those people are not grateful to us. And another piece of rhetoric says that we are surrounded by enemies and we are struggling and we will win. So it's too straightforward, too black and white picture. But it doesn't look like Stalin rhetoric. I'm talking about the later Stalin rhetorics. So it looks like late Brezhnev rhetoric, when the idea to build communism was dropped off, and everything was supported by the idea of nationalism and patriotism, disguised in a communist image. The current rhetoric looks very much like the late Brezhnev rhetoric, less communist slogans. So that's what the state historical policy rests upon. It's quite obvious. I am not going to say who monuments to are built and what veterans we help more and what veterans we help less. What personalities are commemorated and what are not, and so you can see a lot of memory plates on a number of buildings. So, for instance, one of them reads that Marshal Tukhachevsky lived in that house. But it doesn't say that Tukhachevsky was executed in July 1937, or great director Merhold lived here. Well, it looks like we are ashamed of those facts, and it took us quite an effort last year to, 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 to to write on the memory plate to Varlam Shalamov, who spent a lot of years in Gulag. So that memory plate reads that that writer lived in that house between two arrests. So it was a last-minute decision, and only in the last minute a top official resumed responsibility for that. So that plate reads now the person lived there between two arrests. And we are walking through Moscow, and the Moscow is breathing with terror. And we don't have any memory here. You can see anything. In Moscow alone, there are about 40 prisons. Some prisons were arranged in monasteries. Thousands of victims, more than 40,000 people were executed, were shot down in Moscow. Nothing, no memory. In my community, we made a map of terror. We arrange guided tours, but we are a small NGO with very limited resources. So you can see how complex and difficult history is. But I'm convinced that unless we keep that memory of terror, of the rule of terror, you cannot build a state with the rule of law. Back in 1937, 38, 725,000 people were executed by firing squads in this country. And it's really important to understand that out of that number, 93% were executed, and they were sentenced to execution in absentia. There were no court proceedings, no counsel for the prosecution or counsel for the defense. It was done in absentia. So arbitrary rule is a terrible thing. So only with the examples of that arbitrary rule that we can explain to our children what terror was. And it's only on the foundation of that memory that we can build the country with the rule of law. But that memory is to be substantial, featuring facts and figures. We can build the country of freedom. I'm not talking about democracy. Frankly, I don't understand much in democracy. And speaking of my values, current values, and values are normally composed of rights, freedom, and democracy. And it's the rights that top the list. Next comes freedom, and democracy is third. With other people, the sequence can be different. For me, I'm not very much politically oriented person. And it's only that's the reason we didn't understand what terror had meant. And without that, unless we understand and comprehend what terror is, we will not succeed. So I think that brings me to the end of my remarks. Thank you. Colleagues, let's have a discussion. If you make a comment, it should not last longer than 3 minutes. How many questions can you receive at one time? Arseny Borisovich, I'm Natalia. I'm teacher from Yaroslavl. Thank you very much for your remarks. I first make a comment and then ask a question. I work at school, and the theme of repressions, purges, and terror is very important. Children do not know about that. When I started investigating the history of my family, I came across such a situation when I tried to find information in my grannies and grandfathers. I saw a document. It was when collective farms were organized and wealthy farmers were imprisoned and executed. And when the records of the property were made, they couldn't make a list of all the objects that were appropriated, because they didn't know the names of those objects. Those were some agricultural machinery. And following the lists, or at the end of those lists, there is a signature. Chairman Shkurov and Secretary Shnurov. Those two last names in Russian mean very bad things. It cannot be translated. And my question is about the missing documents. What's missing? Okay, so thank you very much. I'm Vadim Korostelov from the Moscow-Helsinki group. Brilliant presentation as usual by Arseny Borisovich. My question about terminology. We spoke with some historians who research deportation events of those peoples that you mentioned, and now they substitute deportation for some other terms. And it was a piece of advice from their lawyers. They do not say deported persons, but internally displaced person. It's really an international term and can be applied to that group of people. But I wonder if you substitute deportation for displacement. Well, perhaps the latter term does not mean everything. It may mean that some people was brought on plane and sent abroad. I wonder if there is data on those deported peoples who were brought to their exile locations, and their numbers when they returned. So how many survived, in other words?
I am responding to all those 3 questions. It's nice that you directed our attention to all the lists of the property, and it was taken away. Do you know the amount of compensation for the property that's taken away today? I mean, your property was taken away. What about compensation? If something, lots of different subjects were taken away from you and you proved your point, you get your compensation up to 6,000 rubles. If your house was also taken away from you, and actually, in this case, maximum compensation will be 10,000 rubles. Now you understand. Do you know what was the lump sum of compensation for the years spent in prison? It is still there in our law, and this is a real shame. Those who were exiled, they didn't get any lump sum compensation. It's only for those who were either in jail or in camps. 100 rubles. 100 rubles. It is still there, the norm in the law for each month spent in jail or in a camp, meaning 60 months of kalima, you multiply it by 10, and that's your compensation. There is a solution of the Constitutional Court. The state in 91 was in one condition. Presently, the state is in different condition. But our legislators do not follow this decision of the Constitutional Court. We see no changes in this regard. And again, the thing that's important for you, you should know it. A teacher is someone who is ready to answer to anything that is true. Otherwise, our memory would disappear. I mean, family memory would be there, of course. But without school teachers and regional or district libraries, without them, the memory would be lost. And there are many people who are not interested, who are not concerned. But if you are a teacher, if you are a real teacher, you still find necessary sources. I was a teacher in the Soviet time. Everything was prohibited. Meaning you were not allowed to speak about this, about that, but you entered the classroom, you closed the door, and I don't remember that anybody was complaining on me. But I can tell you frankly that I spoke whatever I thought right to my pupils. I didn't want to deceive them, to cheat on them. So you ask what documents were lost. In case of individual cases, they are almost all preserved. Well, bar those who were destroyed, being unimportant. For instance, there were cleanings in the towns in the 20s and in the 30s. This was done periodically. And numerous interesting cases, quite small. Small cases. But people were exiled. So such cases were really small and they disappeared, they were destroyed at a certain period of time. And lots of internal documents were destroyed. And without them, it's difficult to understand the history of terror. And the chief issue is access to the archive materials. It's very difficult to get this access. In the relation of terror, we have a network related to our memorial competition, and there are many people in different countries who bring the pupils into municipal or oblast archives and find very important elements. For instance, Penza concentration camp in 1919 and 1922. It was found by a Penza teacher and her pupils, and they made a very interesting work on the subject. The same is true about Siberia. It was done by teachers and their pupils. So, school archive pedagogy is something special. As to deportation or internally displaced persons, for European Court on Human Rights, maybe we should use the term offered by lawyers. But in Russian consciousness, it was called exile, which is not very proper. And people were deported with the loss of property. It's different kind of punishment. It is all based on the decisions of the political bureau of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. And you have documents signed by Politburo almost on everything, or there are orders at the level of the Council of Ministers. I wouldn't use the term displaced persons, internally displaced person. You'd rather use the term deportation. This is really a deportation. Nikolai Bugay, a very cautious person and responsible for a certain sector in one of the regions, he used the term deportation. He's a very cautious person. Now, the question about numbers. It's very difficult to give you numbers. I can tell you how many people died in the process of investigation. There are such statistical figures. There will be many falsities because in 1937 and 38 many people died because they were beaten. They were tortured and beaten. Tortures were in mass scale, and Comrade Stalin personally permitted them, and he wrote the letter to this effect in 1939. So if you take away these exceptions, you can still find some figures. But in Gulag, there were 5 million people arrested, and out of them, about 1.2 were shot. Others were sent to Gulag. How many of them died in Gulag? We don't know. Actually, we have information for each camp, but political and criminal people were not separated from each other. They'll just give you the figure of dead people in their camps. The same is true about the deported statistics. We know how many people were brought into Tajikistan or Uzbekistan. But if you go deeper, well, we see that figures do not connect. Some people were left, some people gave birth to the children, And that's separate studies. Something is done in relation to certain people, but not to all people. Any more questions, dear colleagues? Елена Шурыгина, Rostov-on-Don. Well, we have this kind of stereotype that everybody complained on everybody. Can you dwell upon this? Анна Воронкова.
Вы сказали, что... Сейчас, секундочку. Только на бесправии можно построить... На примерах бесправия.
You said that you need a memory. And on the basis of this memory, you may build a free state. Tell us how you work with schools, how you work with the memory to somehow constructively use it to build the state of freedom. You have information, but what you do with it, how it is used. From Ufa. We deal with the education activity in our work. I am a historian. Where can we find material on repressions? In what textbooks? I'm Victoria, I'm a journalist. Thanks for your lecture. You said that we have to take responsibility for the terror. Recently, I read an article of Lyudmila Petranovskaya, a psychologist. She described the mass conscience. She described what you've been talking, but from the point of view of psychology. Some awful things happened in your life, and you have to somehow live with it. But we were not allowed to speak about the terror, and we still hold this kind of fear. Only now we start actively talking about it. So responsibility for this terror is on the shoulders of the generations who has nothing to do with it. And they still have to take responsibility and to complete this historical step. Can we do it? Yeah, well, it's a good question. Okay, what sources you can use, what textbooks you can use. Whatever you use, if they want to call you a critic of history or anti-patriot, you will be called this. If you honestly base yourself on a Gulag Archipelago by Solzhenitsyn, or on book by Evgenia Ginsburg, or on Kolyma stories by Varlam Shalamov. There are several important studies, but that's for serious historical knowledge, like books by Oleg Khlevnyuk. He's probably our best historian. He's author of a book on Stalin, which is called Хозяин, meaning the boss. You'll easily find these books about post-war Stalinism, and you may use these books. They are informative enough and conceptualized. There is also a book of 7-volume set of documents, History of Stalin's Gulag. The list is pretty big. Well, I cannot go into details here. The question is how to work constructively. I can tell you about my lessons. I take pieces from investigations and I actually distributed it between our pupils. And every teacher invents something on his own. And it was the case. And I compared this case with the criminal code and procedural code. It's not difficult. You can be easily prepared. So you show what is lawlessness, and in the end, you get conviction. Anyway, then your pupils start understand something, what is lawlessness. So I took documents and worked with these documents with my children, with my students. The question of denunciation or information on somebody. I work in archives, and this term does not exist, as a matter of fact. This is a sort of assessment when someone should be judged for false denunciation. There is a certain statistics. For instance, in 1937, Stalin, who started all this horrible game of terror in 1937 and 38, so I said that 725,000 were killed and 1.7 million were arrested. Enormous figure. And this was a mass campaign unleashed by Stalin. And Stalin was interested how you open cases against people, because the state security is so smart. Is this the reason? No, the answer is no. It came from testimonies of people who were arrested before by the state security people. Or they came from the assistance of citizens who want to help to our law enforcers, and they send signals on the pending crimes. So Stalin asked this question of Yezhov. Yezhov definitely wanted to prove to Stalin that citizens truly and happily take all these arrests and they are of help. And it was written by party secretaries as well. And Yezhov had to gather figures to show to Stalin, and he made his reporting in front of Stalin. So out of the so-called signals of citizens, and that's November 1937 till March 38. I cannot give you more details here. So these so-called signals were nothing more than 6% on the number of arrested. 6%. It was in 1937. Clear. There is a certain myth about everybody denouncing on everybody, informing on everybody. This is the myth which was put into people's conscience for many years, because the country was ruled by terror, by fear. You know that the most catastrophic consequence of terror, there are two of them. The first is fear, and second, total mutual mistrust. That's the consequence of terror, which is still with us. And today, it doesn't allow people to be or to show solidarity on any question. This is total mistrust. We get it with our mother's milk. So we were told that all the countries signaled on each other uh, the were denunciations, but 6% is not too little for the mass I talk to you about. If this figure is true, I went through 500 to 600 cases, and there were not too many signals. Well, there are agents, but that's different. Don't mix these things up. A denunciation of your neighbor, that's not when the agent reports to his curator, so to speak. Because the agent is not supposed to listen to who said what. There are no such agents. Nobody needs such agents. Agents are connected to someone who is to be analyzed. And then this agent presents or picks up, gathers the material, and agents who just eavesdrop, I don't know them, and they are not interested. They are of no interest. So they imposed this on us, and we, without knowing of what to do with this awful terror, it's easier for us to blame ourselves, meaning people like us, but bad guys. Bad guys, regular guys, but bad guys. The other option is to blame the state. So we do it with pleasure. The state has nothing to do with it. That's a very interesting phenomenon. So the number of these denunciations is increased, and Russian people is better than we think about it. In 1937, people were arrested and they were tortured. Russian torture is, well, there are two persons and they hit you on your head with a leg of a chair, and in case of another guy, he is not allowed to sit and he stands, and then he drops down, and then they drop water into his face and he has to stand again. This is very heavy, of course. Beating is heavy. And they are told to name all the members of his organization and or list of laboratories where he worked, and he simply named everybody. So the mass of people who were arrested in the mass terror period So in case of these people, someone gave you a number of about a list of about 30 persons, and then agents or KGB people grabbed these persons. So in the periods where there were many people arrested, like 100,000, 120,000, so collective cases were no more than 10%, 15%. Others were individual cases, and in case of mass terror, the group people were more than half, meaning one person testifies against 25 persons. So who was he? Was he a denunciator or something else? So you shouldn't criticize the Russian people in this case. Now the issue of responsibility, it's spiritual question, a moral question. I have worked in Вечерняя Москва newspaper. Oh, sorry, I worked in the evening school. And it was not far from manslaughter, from slaughterhouse. These guys who killed pigs and cows in the daytime, and in the evening they came to me. And the second part of the group were girls, tellers from a local supermarket. So you had to tell them the truth, but in a very simple way. It's difficult because simplification implies untruth. And well, I understood that you don't have to moralize, so to speak, when you give some information. So everybody says that Russia needs repentance. I don't understand this. This is a religious act, repentance. If you think that you have to repent for something, then you do it. But I don't understand how the whole country should repent. President, on behalf of the country, may say, I am sorry. This happens. We know Willy Brandt's story in Warsaw. And in case of Putin, it was also there. I loved one interesting guy, Alexander Yakovlev, assistant of Gorbachev, and for the last 20 years he was responsible for rehabilitation. So he said, repentance, repentance. But what does it really mean? I don't understand. And it's also difficult with responsibility. Civil responsibility is the feeling which a human being may experience and may take it, but someone else wouldn't do it. I don't want to tell you into something, but the civil responsibility for the past events is our way. But I can't tell you guys, take the civil responsibility. And they will definitely make a mix of responsibility and feeling of blame. They will tell you that we are not to blame. Okay, Polish people were killed in Katyn. It was an awful crime, our crime. But somehow we are not to blame, neither us nor our children. But this crime was made following the order of the leaders of our country on our behalf, if you belong to this country. This is a central point for me. the civil responsibility for the past is the civil responsibility for the present, because they act on our behalf. And if I feel responsible, I have to find the truth which I like, and I have to develop my own point of view on the issue. And let's say I am feeling responsible, I have to do something of practical nature.
For instance, if I understand what this episode means, I should really do something. And in case with cutting execution, I'm still confident that victims of cutting are to be justified according to the Russian law of acquittal. So we killed those people and we have to acquit them of all accusations. And the reason is that many people are against acquittal, is that if you acquit some victim, you'll have to pay compensations. But it's not true, because if your grandfather was executed, your mother didn't receive anything but just a piece of paper that the person was acquitted. And it means that, again, the state recognizes that the crime was committed on behalf of the state, and our ultimate objective is to achieve some practical results. For me, the civil responsibility for those crimes, if we're talking about teenagers, is that in my case it were teenagers, school children, who really helped me with the map of terror in Moscow. Just a small area around the Lubyanka Square. I'll leave some copies here, you'll see it. It's just an example what can be done in any city. So school children go to the streets, they collect information on the buildings where people were imprisoned and executed. It's kind of a local geographic society, but it's very purposeful. And in modern conditions, everything can be digitalized, and so again, the person can either assume responsibility or reject it, and we should not pressure those who reject responsibility. It means that we fail to explain to the person that. But certainly, if we have 30 pupils in a class, at least 3-4 students will realize everything, and that will be specific fruits of your effort, of your contribution. So responsibility, is very important because people should be united not only by the fact that we all walk across the same streets, or we cannot be united over a desire to drive some good car. So if we are united not only by by only those things, but if we are united by the truth about our past and our present, then we will feel responsibility. And as for the format, most commonly the format is to be proactive. Do you know how many court trials we lost around the cutting case? 32 cases in court I lost. And it looks like to win we need amendments to the current legislation. So by and large, dear friends, you cannot make people do something. It can happen only if people realize something, and if they don't, it means that we fail. But again, it's not a tragedy, because as a teacher, some 10% of your class become responsible people, it's great performance. Dear colleagues, in conclusion, I would like to say that historic memory and all efforts around that is something that is very much valued by our school. So we invite Arseny Borisovich once or twice a year. Every year he comes alone or with Mr. Daniel, and that's our conventional practices. We believe it's very important for our future. So a lot of thanks to Arseny Borisovich, who agreed to come again, and our compliments to the Memorial Society for their contribution. We are also invited to join efforts with the Memorial. We have some joint programs with them. It's a very close organization for us. Personally, I would like to thank you again, because in 2011 we had a workshop of the school in Perm, and you guided us through the tour of Perm 36. And besides, it was an excellent excursion. We saw the problems of that museum, and think what happened to that organization is another problem of the contemporary times, when we are destroying the memory, when we are trying to destroy symbols of the of the Soviet Empire that I believe not to be relevant. And Perm 36 is a museum of Gulag, and now when we can see a lot of things pertaining to those times destroyed, it's very sad. And but people are not are not disturbed by that mostly, but there are such prominent people there. Arseny Borisovich, and I would like to thank him for that daily deed that has become a reality, and for his continuous effort today, tomorrow, day after tomorrow. It's all done for our benefits. Thank you. I leave some copies of that terror map here, so you can take a copy if you wish.